They said a Tudor marriage was stable, yet most of its suffering never made it into the records. Behind those polished halls were women enduring what silence alone could hold. Men shaping power no one dared question, and other women living on the edge of uncertainty. Every smile hid a negotiation. Every corridor stored a secret, and every room carried the weight of someone's fear. Tonight, we step inside that house to feel what history tried to soften. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone were to stand at the threshold of a Tudor household, they might be surprised by how little affection shaped the marriages within its walls. The appearance of harmony was carefully arranged, but beneath it lay an agreement crafted by families, assets, and expectations that had nothing to do with personal desire. A marriage in this world began long before the couple ever met, discussed, or imagined a shared future. It was drafted in writing, spoken in negotiations, and finalized through alliances that reached further than the two people who would live together afterward. The bride's place was fixed by her lineage, and the groom's acceptance of her was a continuation of family strategy more than a private wish. For a woman entering her husband's home, the moment was less a beginning of companionship and more a transfer of responsibility between two families. She was not chosen for her personality, her humor, or her preferences. She arrived as a representative of her kin, a symbol of the alliances they hoped to maintain or strengthen. Her wedding gown, no matter how ornate, functioned as a contract more than a celebration. Each embroidered detail carrying expectations she had never agreed to but was required to fulfill. The household that received her saw her as an extension of property, valuable, necessary, but ultimately replaceable if circumstances demanded it. Within this structure, personal affection was treated as a luxury rather than a foundation. Husbands were not expected to adore their wives, and wives were not given room to cultivate intimacy on their own terms. Emotional connection might appear, but it was accidental, never guaranteed, and certainly never required. Thus, the community surrounding them did not question this arrangement because the purpose of marriage was stability, inheritance, and the outward face of order. Whether the two individuals involved felt comfort or loneliness was irrelevant to the system that shaped their lives. In many Tudor homes, the new bride quickly discovered that her duties were already waiting for her, managing servants, ensuring supplies, presenting herself properly during gatherings, and behaving in a way that reflected positively on both families. None of these obligations accounted for her inner life. She had no space to voice dissatisfaction, much less refusal. A wife was expected to endure, adapt, and accept the rules of a household whose rhythms were established long before she arrived. Her presence was required, but her wants were not part of the calculation. The distance between husband and wife could be polite, formal, and quiet. They shared a roof, but not necessarily a bond. Conversations might revolve around practical matters, schedules, land, and reputation. In private, many wives learned to hide their personal hopes, storing them away as carefully as they folded linens, because speaking them aloud would achieve nothing. They were told from a young age that restraint was virtue, obedience was strength, and emotional needs were dangerous distractions. Looking at this arrangement through a modern lens, it is striking how little choice existed for either side. The couple acted out roles that society handed them without question. Yet the burden fell far more heavily on the woman. She carried expectations of grace, loyalty, and silence. Even when the marriage she entered lacked kindness, or even simple companionship. The structure was polished on the outside, with celebrations and blessings marking the union. But the internal truth was often cold and impersonal. Family alliances were treated as currency. A daughter married well meant future security. A match with inadequate connections could weaken an entire household's position. Because of this, the marriage bed was discussed in terms of heirs, not emotions. The continuity of bloodlines mattered more than the comfort of the individuals charged with producing them. Children legitimized the union, strengthened property ties, and solidified status. In this environment, romance held no weight compared to duty. For the bride, stepping into her new home felt less like forming a partnership and more like entering a well-constructed system that had no intention of bending for her. The architecture of marriage was rigid, designed to maintain order rather than nurture affection. She learned quickly that her value lay in her ability to serve the needs of the family, not to seek fulfillment for herself. The idea of love as the foundation of marriage would have been dismissed as idealistic or even foolish. A Tudor wife lived with the understanding that her personal desires were irrelevant to the societal machinery surrounding her. She was praised when she blended into the structure seamlessly and judged harshly if she showed signs of individual will. Her life became a careful balancing act of obedience, presentation, and quiet endurance. And while the world celebrated the grandeur of Tudor families, the emotional cost was borne privately by women who had no say in the direction of their own lives. The arrangement worked only because everyone pretended it did, leaving affection outside the doorway where no one had to confront its absence. Yet in the quiet corners of these homes, something heavier than tradition settled over the lives of newly married women. And not far ahead, another presence waits inside the same house, shaping their fate in ways they were never warned about. A Tudor household offered no real corners for solitude, no stretches of silence that belonged to any single person. Every room carried footsteps, voices, and the constant movement of people whose presence was never optional. Servants drifted through corridors before dawn, tending fires, fetching water, and preparing the day's tasks with practiced familiarity. Relatives who lived under the same roof lingered in shared spaces, their routines woven tightly into the family's daily life. Guests stayed for weeks or months, treating the house as if it were an extension of their own. Privacy was not an expectation here. It was an idea the household had never been built to allow. The architecture itself encouraged exposure. Rooms opened into one another with little separation. Walls were thin, staircases narrow, and doors often left unlatched. Anyone passing through a hallway could glimpse inside a chamber, overhear a conversation, or witness small interactions that revealed more than the participants intended. Servants slept near their duties, not in distant quarters, meaning their presence lingered everywhere. At the foot of staircases, beside the kitchen, outside the master chambers, their proximity blurred the lines between family and labor, giving them access to the most intimate moments without ever being acknowledged as part of them. Within this environment, a wife quickly understood that all aspects of her life were visible in ways she could not control. Her movements were noted, her tone remembered, her expressions interpreted. A quiet sigh, to a hesitation, a brief pause at the doorway. Nothing went unseen in a house where dozens of eyes observed without appearing to watch. Even conversations meant to be discreet often filtered through the household, carried by servants who moved silently and relatives who had long mastered the art of listening without being noticed. Relationships, too, unfolded under constant observation. The distance or closeness between husband and wife, the warmth or coldness exchanged at mealtimes, the rare moments of tension or displeasure. These details spread through the household long before the couple themselves realized how many people had noticed. Servants whispered in corners, relatives compared impressions, and guests drew conclusions based solely on what they saw when passing through a room. The household functioned like a living network, gathering and spreading information faster than anyone could contain it. In this setting, the arrival of another woman never remained secret for long. Whether she was a favored servant, a distant cousin, or a quiet guest who stayed too comfortably, her presence shifted the atmosphere of the house in an instant. People noticed who lingered near her, who spoke to her softly, and who avoided her. They saw whose steps quickened when she entered the room, and whose expression tightened at the sight of her. A wife had no chance to process her emotions privately. The household processed them alongside her, interpreting every glance before she had even named the feeling herself. Daily life became a performance of restraint. A wife could not retreat to her chambers to escape tension because those chambers were never entirely hers. Servants entered at all hours to dress her, tend the fire, or deliver messages. Relatives appeared without warning, seeking conversation or simply passing through. Even the small task of closing a door meant little in a house where doors did not grant separation. The walls seemed to listen, and the floors seemed to repeat what they heard. The lack of privacy did more than expose personal struggles. It shaped them. When everyone witnessed every shift in behavior, the wife learned to conceal emotions before they formed fully. She guarded her expression carefully, smoothing away signs of disappointment or suspicion. She moved through the house with the same measured grace regardless of what she felt, because the household was ready to notice even the slightest disruption. She understood that the wrong expression at the wrong moment could spark speculation she could not control. In a modern sense, it would be like living in a house with transparent walls, where every conversation, every hesitation, and every disagreement became shared property. The Tudor household operated under that same clarity, though it was imposed by proximity instead of glass. In such a world, misunderstandings were quick to form, and truths were slow to surface. People saw pieces of a story and assumed the whole of it. A wife carried the weight of these assumptions, whether they were accurate or not. There was no escape from the scrutiny because the house existed as a single organism, breathing and shifting with the lives inside it. The dynamics of power, affection, and rivalry all played out openly, shaped by whispers and glances more than by spoken words. To survive in such an environment, a wife learned to adapt, observing just as carefully as she was observed. Nothing in the house stayed still, and nothing stayed hidden for long. Life in the Tudor household unfolded in plain sight, leaving no space for secrecy or quiet grief. Another layer of tension waited in the routines that governed this crowded world, shaping how each woman learned to endure it. And somewhere inside that lack of privacy, a deeper conflict began to form long before anyone dared acknowledge it. A Tudor wife lived within a structure that defined her value long before she had any chance to define herself. The law placed her firmly beneath her husband, binding her identity to his authority in ways that shaped every aspect of her existence. Property flowed through his hand, not hers. Land, income, possessions, and even items she brought into the marriage became part of his domain the moment she crossed the threshold of his house. She could manage household resources, but she could not claim ownership. Her role resembled stewardship without rights, responsibility without legal standing. This imbalance was so deeply rooted in daily life that many people accepted it without question. A wife's signature carried no legal power. She could not enter into contracts, challenge decisions, or direct inheritance. Even when she displayed intelligence or strong organizational ability, the credit folded neatly back toward the husband, who remained the only recognized authority. Her work sustained the home, yet the home legally belonged to someone else. The walls she tended, the food she oversaw, the linens she inspected, all existed under his name, not hers. Disagreement held its own dangers. A wife was expected to maintain a facade of support even when decisions affected her directly. even when the consequences touched her personal well-being. Public protest was unthinkable. To contradict her husband openly risked damaging not only her reputation but the reputation of the entire household. Silence, therefore, became a form of survival. In a world where the community watched carefully and judged quickly, a single misplaced word could brand her difficult, disobedient, or unfit. Once that impression took hold, recovery was nearly impossible. The pressure extended far beyond the marriage itself. A wife represented her family of origin, as well as the family she married into. Any sign of emotional struggle or dissatisfaction was interpreted as weakness, as if her private feelings threatened the stability of broader alliances. She learned early that her personal discomfort weighed far less than the honor of her relatives. Their expectations wrapped around her like a second skin, tight, unyielding, and impossible to remove. Inside the household, this legal imbalance shaped everyday interactions. Decisions about finances, discipline, property, and relationships all flowed from the husband downward. A wife could advise, but she could not override. She could plead, but she could not command. Even her own children were legally tied to the father's authority, leaving her in the strange position of nurturing lives she did not truly control. The distinction between responsibility and power blurred in painful ways. Because she lacked authority, she relied heavily on perception. If she appeared calm, dutiful, and composed, she could influence decisions through subtlety. If she faltered, others stepped in. Relatives, advisors, and even favored servants, often pushing her further to the margins. The house became a stage where she performed compliance, hoping her quiet stability would be enough to protect her position. But nothing in Tudor society guaranteed stability to a woman without rights. Viewed through a modern lens, her situation resembles someone working tirelessly in a role they could never claim, inside a structure that benefited from their labor while denying them recognition. The restraint required was relentless. Every day reinforced the message that her safety depended on her ability to disappear behind duty. Her emotions could not stand in the way of the family's reputation. Her opinions could not complicate the machinery of alliances. Her life was measured by how well she upheld expectations that had never been hers to choose. Despite this, many wives carried their burdens quietly, moving through hallways with practiced composure. Their endurance was not born from weakness, but from necessity. They understood that any visible struggle could provoke scrutiny, and scrutiny could unravel whatever small stability they had managed to create. In such a world, dignity became something they assembled piece by piece. Held together by silence and careful behavior, the legal structure left wives with responsibility but no authority, shaping every moment of their married lives. Another shift waited within the household, where the roles assigned to each woman collided with the hidden hierarchies beneath the surface. Somewhere inside those quiet collisions, the cost of survival grew even sharper. Life inside a Tudor household often revealed a quiet imbalance that shaped every interaction, even when no one spoke of it aloud. The legal wife might carry the title that placed her at the head of the home, yet her position was never as secure as the ceremonies that had installed her there. Authority depended less on status than on the unpredictable movements of favor. A single shift in the husband's attention could redraw the unspoken hierarchy of the house, leaving the wife in a place that felt narrower than the corridors she walked each day. Other women within the home, maids, distant relatives, widows, and companions, moved through the same rooms, sharing the same air and participating in the same routines. Their presence was not unusual, but the weight assigned to that presence could change suddenly. A brief exchange of warmth, a longer conversation at the fire, a smile that lingered a moment too long. These tiny gestures were enough for the household to take notice. Servants, skilled observers by necessity, sensed these shifts instantly. Their reactions traveled quietly through the home, adjusting to the woman they believed now held the rising influence. For the wife, this constant awareness felt like walking through her own life while someone else rearranged the pieces without warning. She monitored voices in the hall, pose in conversation, and the tone her husband used when speaking to the women around him. She knew that to react openly would mark her as insecure, and insecurity was treated as a personal failing. A Tudor wife protected herself not by confronting the threat, but by containing every flicker of emotion. Silence, even here, served as both shield and burden. The structure of the house made these dynamics impossible to escape. Rooms connected directly to one another, with thin walls and doors that offered little separation. Servants passed constantly through chambers to maintain fires, fetch clothing, or carry messages. Privacy was a luxury found rarely and briefly. A wife might step into a room seeking a moment alone, only to find someone already there. Someone who noticed her expression before she had time to smooth it. Every sigh felt recorded. Every hesitation observed. A favoured woman, even one with no official standing, could alter the atmosphere of the household simply by existing near the husband. She might receive small, telling gestures, a chair pulled closer to the warmth of the hearth, a cup of wine served before others, a softer tone in conversation. These privileges had no legal significance, yet their emotional effect was profound. They reminded the wife that the respect she held could be overshadowed by someone whose only advantage was proximity to the husband's interest. Inside the home, alliances shifted quietly. Servants adjusted their behavior almost imperceptibly, offering quicker assistance to the woman they believed might gain influence. Relatives watched interactions with careful eyes, judging the changes without speaking of them directly. The wife recognized these signs even when no one acknowledged them. Her place in the household depended on stability, yet stability was the one thing she could not guarantee. Living under such conditions required a discipline that went beyond social expectations. The wife adopted a calm demeanor, not because she felt calm, but because she had no choice. She maintained steady gestures, measured speech, and a composed expression even when fear or resentment pressed against her composure. Her survival depended on appearing unaffected, even when her heart tightened at every subtle shift in the home's atmosphere. Modern comparison makes the situation clearer. Imagine a workplace where the title on one's door remains the same, but real power shifts daily toward whoever stands closest to the person in charge. No official announcements, no formal changes, just small behaviors that signal a reordering of influence. The Tudor wife lived inside that instability, unable to challenge it, unable to retreat from it, forced to carry herself as if she were unmoved by it. The hierarchy of the home existed on two levels: the visible one, shaped by law and ceremony, and the invisible one, shaped by attention and desire. The wife sat at the top of the first, but often struggled within the second. Her role required endurance, decorum, and restraint, even when she sensed her place being quietly encroached upon. She walked through her home with dignity, but that dignity did not shield her from the silent contests unfolding in every shared room. The fragile balance of standing above others in name, but not always in influence, shaped every day the wife spent under her own roof. Another shift emerged in the ways these women were identified and judged, revealing who truly occupied space within the household. Beneath that shifting presence, new boundaries formed that no one dared to mark aloud. The presence of other women inside a Tudor household was rarely accidental. They belonged to the structure of the home in ways that blurred the lines between duty, companionship, and quiet rivalry. Some were long-term companions to the husband, women whose connection to him had formed over years rather than weeks. Their existence was not formally acknowledged, yet the household understood their place without being told. They moved through rooms with a confidence shaped by familiarity, not by title. A wife could pass them in a corridor and see in their calm expression a history she had never been invited to witness. These relationships did not always begin with intention. Sometimes they developed from proximity, shared tasks, shared routines, and conversations that drifted unchallenged into moments of personal closeness. What made such women dangerous was not their station, but their access. They occupied spaces the wife could not monitor and shared hours with the husband she could not control. Over time, the household learned to watch the subtle gestures that revealed their influence. A softened tone, a private smile, a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long. Beyond these, long-standing companions were the favoured maids. Women who served the family, yet held a place dangerously close to its emotional centre. They saw the husband before the household fully woke, tended his clothing, heard his unguarded remarks, and existed in a position where familiarity could easily masquerade as affection. Their youth, availability, and constant presence made them vulnerable to being drawn into relationships far more complicated than their duties allowed. When a maid became favoured, the consequences echoed through the home. Doors opened a little more quickly for her. Tasks others disliked quietly disappeared from her list. Servants whispered her name with caution, sensing the rising influence that came not from rank, but from proximity. For the wife, the favoured maid represented a threat more intimate than a formal mistress. She was woven into the household in a practical, inescapable way. Removing her risked scandal. Complaining risked looking petty. Ignoring her risked losing ground entirely. The wife learned to mask her unease when the maid entered a room, carrying linens or tending the fire, while the husband's expression softened in ways he never explained. The maid herself might not seek power, but power finds shape easily in houses built on observation. Then there were the widows and female relatives who stayed indefinitely, women who arrived under the guise of family obligation and slowly settled into a comfort that surpassed their intended role. Some were harmless, others were watchful. Still, others carried their own ambitions, sharpened quietly by the security of living in a house that was not theirs, yet offered the stability they lacked. These women often positioned themselves close to the husband, offering advice, support, or simple companionship. Their presence, framed as loyalty, often carried an undercurrent of intrusion. In the tightly packed world of a Tudor household, these women became part of the wife's daily landscape. She passed them in hallways, sat across from them at meals, heard their voices in the courtyard, and sensed their influence in the small shifts of the household's behaviour. None of them needed to declare their importance. The home itself revealed it. A servant lingering too long near a particular woman, a relative offering her an unnecessary kindness, a child drawn to her presence. All these signs accumulated until the wife could no longer ignore what was forming around her. Modern comparison makes the situation easier to grasp. Living in a space where personal boundaries do not exist, where one's partner interacts daily with women who share rooms, duties, and emotional access impossible to separate from the rhythms of the home. The wife could not remove herself from these dynamics. She could not ask questions without risking humiliation. She could not assert her authority without appearing insecure. Instead, she carried the weight of their presence silently, measuring every shift in the air and every change in expression with a precision learned through necessity. Some of these women wielded their influence knowingly, others drifted into it by chance, without understanding how deeply their actions affected the wife's fragile position. But intention did not matter. Impact did. And the impact was felt most deeply by the one woman expected to maintain dignity while watching her place in the home subtly tested day after day. The household rarely judged these women openly. Instead, it absorbed them, adapting around their presence until they became fixtures of the domestic world. Their roles shifted with rumour, affection, and opportunity, The wife's role, however, remained constant in name, but unstable in reality. She was expected to remain gracious, composed, and perceptive enough to read the changes unfolding around her. The women who shared her home shaped her days more than she dared to admit, each one carrying a small part of the power she was supposed to hold alone. Their presence created new tensions that pushed silently against the fragile order of the household. Within that rising pressure, another layer of conflict was prepared to reveal itself. Affairs in a Tudor household rarely unfolded in secrecy, no matter how discreet the husband believed himself to be. The structure of daily life made concealment nearly impossible. Servants moved constantly through shared rooms. Relatives lingered at staircases, and the thin walls of the house carried voices farther than anyone intended. A whispered conversation could pass through a doorway. A lingering touch could be seen from the corner of an adjacent chamber, and a late-night visit could be noted by someone tending the fire before dawn. Nothing remained hidden for long in a home built on constant activity. People inside the household understood these relationships without needing explanations. A shift in the husband's tone when he addressed a particular woman, the way he paused when she entered a room, or the ease with which she walked near him. These small details spread quietly through the home. Servants were the first to notice, because they watched everything while pretending to see nothing. They exchanged glances, adjusted their behavior, and carried the knowledge silently through the corridors. Their silence did not erase the truth, it gave it shape. The wife felt the truth long before anyone said a word. She recognized the subtle patterns that returned day after day. The servant who delivered messages at convenient moments. The relative who defended the woman too quickly. The lingering scent of perfume in a room the husband had just left. These signs formed a quiet map of behavior that she followed carefully, even when she wished she could look away. The situation did not need confrontation to exist. It existed because the entire household, without speaking, acknowledged it. Public denial was unnecessary because the affair was not truly hidden. Meals revealed its presence in the way seating arrangements shifted slightly. Walks in the garden revealed it in the way paths converged too often to be a coincidence. Household gatherings revealed it in the glances exchanged across a crowded room. Even the children sensed the change, noticing who received gentler smiles and who was ignored with careful precision. The affair lived openly in the spaces between daily moments, shaping them more than anyone admitted. The wife's role in this dynamic was the most painful. She was expected to see, but not react. Understand, but not accuse. Endure, but not resist. Her dignity depended on silence, and silence became the measure of her worth. A single spoken complaint could be twisted into weakness or jealousy, reflecting poorly on her rather than on the husband who caused the tension. The household watched her more closely than anyone else, waiting to see whether she would maintain the composure demanded of her. There was no acceptable way for her to acknowledge what she knew. If she pretended ignorance, she appeared naive. If she showed awareness, she appeared unstable. The narrow path she was forced to walk allowed no misstep. She learned to hold her expression steady, even when every glance felt like a reminder of her diminishing place in the home. Her awareness became a private burden, carried quietly through hallways, crowded with people who treated the affair as another ordinary part of household life. In modern terms, it is similar to working in a place where everyone knows a betrayal is happening. Yet, social rules prevent anyone from addressing it. The Tudor household operated on that same unspoken agreement. People saw the truth and moved around it, shaping their behavior to accommodate what could not be named. The affair's visibility made it both undeniable and untouchable. It altered the atmosphere of the home, settling into its routines with the same familiarity as the morning fire or the evening meal. The wife lived inside that atmosphere, breathing it daily, knowing that everyone around her understood the situation as clearly as she did. Her silence protected her reputation, but it also deepened the isolation she could never freely admit. The open presence of these relationships shaped the household more profoundly than words ever could, leaving the wife suspended between knowledge and silence. Another difficulty emerged as she learned to endure this constant exposure without losing her place. Under that strain, a new kind of emotional burden began to take hold. Silence shaped the life of a Tudor wife long before she ever entered her husband's household. It was taught to her in childhood, reinforced through lessons disguised as virtues, and praised by elders who believed a quiet woman preserved the dignity of her family. By the time she became a wife, silence had become less a habit than a requirement. Speaking too freely risked scrutiny. Asking questions risked offending someone with the power to harm her standing. Expressing hurt risked being labelled unstable. The safest choice, the one repeated to her since girlhood, was to swallow every discomfort and present stillness as strength. Inside the home, this expectation deepened. A wife learned that silence was not merely preferred. It was demanded. The household moved under unwritten rules that accepted her obedience as a natural part of its foundation. Her concerns held little weight in a structure where her husband's authority overshadowed every opinion she might have voiced. Even small protests, the kind that should have been harmless, were interpreted as disrespect. The act of speaking honestly became a gamble with consequences she could not control. Servants, relatives, and visitors observed her constantly, judging her composure as much as her actions. Any sign of distress risked becoming a whisper in the corridors, spreading quickly and reshaping how others treated her. A moment of frustration could be twisted into a failure. A brief display of emotion magnified into a flaw. She understood that words could betray her more easily than silence ever could. Yes, so she held them tightly, letting them settle heavily in her chest while her expression remained calm. Complaint, in particular, carried its own dangers. A wife who voiced dissatisfaction was seen as ungrateful or difficult, even when her concerns were justified. The system around her treated resilience as a moral duty and suffering as evidence of character. If she struggled, she was told to endure. If she felt wronged, she was told to reflect inward. The more she endured, the more people praised her dignity, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that her restraint was shaped by fear rather than serenity. Endurance became so normalized that even the wife herself sometimes forgot where the boundary lay between patience and suppression. She learned to quiet her thoughts before they formed fully, to erase her reactions before they reached her face, to breathe slowly when her heart tightened. She existed in a world where emotional discipline mattered more than emotional truth. Over time, silence settled into her like a second skeleton, ardrechid, familiar, and painfully necessary. In a modern sense, it resembles someone living inside a room where the walls absorb every word spoken but echo every moment of quiet. The Tudor wife knew that stillness protected her far better than honesty ever could. Silence kept her safe from judgment, from scandal, from accusations of jealousy or instability. Yet that safety came with isolation so deep that even she struggled to recognize its full weight. The more she mastered silence, the less space she had to exist freely within her own life. Despite the heaviness of this expectation, she carried herself with controlled grace. She moved through the household with careful steps, offering polite smiles and steady tones, never revealing the exhaustion behind them. Her restraint became a performance refined through necessity, admired by outsiders who mistook it for peace. No one saw the quiet labor required to maintain it. No one acknowledged how silence carved away small pieces of her spirit. The ideal wife, as the household defined it, was a woman who accepted more than she expressed, who endured more than she revealed, and who maintained composure even when her world shifted around her. Silence, taught to her as virtue, became both armor and cage, and each day she lived beneath its weight, She learned that her value was measured not by her voice, but by how effectively she concealed it. The discipline of silence shaped her identity more deeply than any rule spoken aloud, leaving her to navigate the household through restraint rather than expression. Another pressure formed as she confronted expectations that demanded strength without acknowledgement. Within that tightening space, a different kind of struggle waited to appear. Silence shaped the life of a Tudor wife long before she ever entered her husband's household. It was taught to her in childhood, reinforced through lessons disguised as virtues, and praised by elders who believed a quiet woman preserved the dignity of her family. By the time she became a wife, silence had become less a habit than a requirement. Speaking too freely risked scrutiny. Asking questions risked offending someone with the power to harm her standing. Expressing hurt risked being labelled unstable. The safest choice, the one repeated to her since girlhood, was to swallow every discomfort and present stillness as strength. Inside the home, this expectation deepened. A wife learned that silence was not merely preferred. It was demanded. The household moved under unwritten rules that accepted her obedience as a natural part of its foundation. Her concerns held little weight in a structure where her husband's authority overshadowed every opinion she might have voiced. Even small protests, the kind that should have been harmless, were interpreted as disrespect. The act of speaking honestly became a gamble with consequences she could not control. Servants, relatives, and visitors observed her constantly, judging her composure as much as her actions. Any sign of distress risked becoming a whisper in the corridors, spreading quickly and reshaping how others treated her. A moment of frustration could be twisted into a failure. A brief display of emotion magnified into a flaw. She understood that words could betray her more easily than silence ever could. So she held them tightly, letting them settle heavily in her chest, while her expression remained calm. Complaint, in particular, carried its own dangers. A wife who voiced dissatisfaction was seen as ungrateful or difficult, even when her concerns were justified. The system around her treated resilience as a moral duty and suffering as evidence of character. If she struggled, she was told to endure. If she felt wronged, she was told to reflect inward. The more she endured, the more people praised her dignity, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that her restraint was shaped by fear rather than serenity. Endurance became so normalized that even the wife herself sometimes forgot where the boundary lay between patience and suppression. She learned to quiet her thoughts before they formed fully, to erase her reactions before they reached her face, to breathe slowly when her heart tightened. She existed in a world where emotional discipline mattered more than emotional truth. Over time, silence settled into her like a second skeleton, rigid, familiar, and painfully necessary. In a modern sense, it resembles someone living inside a room where the walls absorb every word spoken, but echo every moment of quiet. The Tudor wife knew that stillness protected her far better than honesty ever could. Silence kept her safe from judgment, from scandal, from accusations of jealousy or instability. Yet that safety came with isolation so deep that even she struggled to recognize its full weight. The more she mastered silence, the less space she had to exist freely within her own life. Despite the heaviness of this expectation, she carried herself with controlled grace. She moved through the household with careful steps, offering polite smiles and steady tones, never revealing the exhaustion behind them. Her restraint became a performance refined through necessity, admired by outsiders who mistook it for peace. No one saw the quiet labor required to maintain it. No one acknowledged how silence carved away small pieces of her spirit. The ideal wife, as the household defined it, was a woman who accepted more than she expressed, who endured more than she revealed, and who maintained composure even when her world shifted around her. Silence, taught to her as virtue, became both armor and cage, and each day she lived beneath its weight. She learned that her value was measured not by her voice, but by how effectively she concealed it. The discipline of silence shaped her identity more deeply than any rule spoken aloud, leaving her to navigate the household through restraint rather than expression. Another pressure formed as she confronted expectations that demanded strength without acknowledgement. Within that tightening space, a different kind of struggle waited to appear. Coexistence in a Tudor household demanded a discipline that reached far beyond ordinary courtesy. A wife learned quickly that survival depended on her ability to navigate the home with restraint. Even when her position was challenged in ways she could neither prevent nor confront, direct conflict was considered improper, almost scandalous, because it threatened the fragile illusion of harmony that the household depended upon. The unwritten rules required her to absorb discomfort silently, to smooth every sharp feeling before it reached her voice, and to maintain an appearance of calm even when the atmosphere around her shifted in ways she could not ignore. Avoiding confrontation was not simply a preference, it was an expectation woven into every aspect of her married life. If she attempted to address an issue openly, she risked appearing unstable or disrespectful. The household judged her not by the fairness of her concerns, but by the steadiness of her reaction. Emotion was treated as a disruption, and disruption reflected poorly on her, not on the circumstances that caused it. So she practiced restraint carefully, learning to redirect her thoughts rather than her words. She allowed grievances to settle quietly inside her because speaking them would only weaken her position. Maintaining a pleasant appearance became part of this discipline. No matter how strained her marriage felt or how uncomfortable the presence of other women became, she was expected to greet each day with steadiness. Her demeanor at meals, her tone in conversation, her posture during gatherings, all served as evidence of her suitability as a wife. The household observed her constantly, interpreting her politeness as maturity and her calmness as virtue. Beneath that surface, she carried a weight that no one acknowledged. Yet, if she allowed even a small crack to show, she risked drawing attention she could not afford. Small gestures mattered the most. A smile that lingered too briefly, a pause too long before answering, a lowered gaze at the wrong moment. Each detail could become the subject of quiet speculation. Servants repeated what they saw without intending harm. Relatives commented on her mood under the guise of concern, and visitors formed conclusions based solely on how she carried herself in public. The wife understood that losing composure meant losing respect, and losing respect meant losing influence in a home where she already had so little control. Protecting her husband's image was another requirement she could not escape, even when his actions caused her pain, even when rumors or observations sharpened her suspicions. She was expected to shield him from embarrassment. A wife who spoke of her husband's faults, even privately, risked damaging the reputation of the entire household. Her silence became a defense not just for him, but for the broader network of alliances that depended on the appearance of stability. The burden of preserving this image rested almost entirely on her shoulders. In moments when she was hurt, she concealed it. When she sensed another woman gaining influence, she adjusted her behavior to hide any sign of jealousy. When her authority as the lady of the house was quietly tested, she responded with polite firmness rather than anger. Each response was calculated to protect her place without drawing attention to the conflict she felt. Her life became a delicate performance in which she balanced vulnerability with control, all under the constant gaze of the household. In a modern sense, her situation resembles someone living in a workplace where every interaction is monitored, where personal frustration must be hidden behind professionalism, and where challenging unfair treatment could result in loss of position. The Tudor wife maintained this posture not for hours, but for years, shaping herself into someone who reacted cautiously to every shift in tone or gesture around her. The rules governed her behavior so thoroughly that breaking them felt dangerous, almost unthinkable. Despite the pressure, she adapted to these expectations with a quiet strength that went unnoticed by those who benefited from it. She learned to speak gently, to move thoughtfully, and to respond with measured grace, even when her heart pulled her toward anger or grief. Her restraint prevented scandal, protected alliances, and kept the household running smoothly. But it also deepened the isolation she carried, the feeling of living behind a mask that everyone admired but no one questioned. These unspoken rules shaped her identity as much as they shaped her daily life. They taught her that dignity required silence, that respectability required composure, and that her place depended on how well she maintained both in the face of challenges she could not acknowledge. Each day demanded the same careful balance, the same quiet control, the same steady performance for an audience that never stopped watching. The rules that governed her behavior carved boundaries she could not cross, forcing her to preserve harmony even when it cost her peace. Another strain emerged as she faced expectations that treated endurance as the only acceptable response. Behind those expectations, a deeper emotional cost began to surface quietly. Religious teaching in Tudor society shaped a wife's understanding of her role long before she ever learned the daily rhythms of marriage. Sermons, prayers, and household lessons all reinforced the idea that patience, humility, and quiet suffering were signs of a righteous woman. These beliefs did not simply hover in the background. They guided how she interpreted her duties, how she processed her emotions, and how she responded to the difficulties that unfolded around her. Faith, for her, became both a source of comfort and a system of expectations that left little room for resistance. The church framed endurance as a woman's sacred responsibility. Passages from Scripture were used to remind her that obedience strengthened virtue and that submission reflected divine order. She heard repeatedly that a wife must honor her husband, even when he failed to honor her in return. These teachings reached her from many directions, spoken by clergy during worship, reinforced by family members, and absorbed from the moral stories told to young girls. By the time she entered adulthood, endurance felt less like a choice and more like a command she was obligated to fulfill. Within the household, these beliefs created a framework that justified her silence. When she suffered in private, the church's language offered explanations that aligned her pain with spiritual purpose. Hardship was described as a trial meant to test her character. Emotional struggle was framed as an opportunity to grow closer to God. Any desire to speak out, demand fairness, or confront wrongdoing felt not only socially inappropriate, but spiritually misplaced. To challenge her circumstances was to challenge the moral script she had been taught to follow. This mindset carried into her marriage with quiet but powerful influence. If her husband acted harshly, she was told to respond with gentleness. If he favored another woman, she was told to maintain dignity. If he neglected her, she was told that patience reflected her faith. Religious virtue became intertwined with domestic submission so completely that the difference between devotion and self-erasure grew difficult to recognize. A devout wife was expected to hold her suffering with grace, and any sign of struggle was interpreted as a lack of spiritual discipline. The household reinforced these lessons through daily rituals. Morning prayers emphasized humility. Evening devotions praised those who accepted hardship without complaint. Servants observed her posture during worship. Relatives noted her tone when discussing faith, and the community measured her piety through her behavior. A wife who failed to display quiet endurance risked being judged as spiritually weak, even if her circumstances were deeply unfair. The faith she was raised in became a lens through which others evaluated her worth. For many wives, religion offered genuine comfort, but the comfort was tightly entwined with obligation. She prayed not only for strength, but for the ability to suppress feelings that might conflict with religious ideals. Her emotions became something she managed internally, while voicing the patience expected of her. Even her private relationship with God was shaped by the fear of appearing ungrateful or lacking devotion. It is difficult to separate her faith from the pressure that accompanied it. In a modern sense, her situation resembles someone encouraged to endure mistreatment, because doing so aligns with a higher moral standard. The justification makes the pain easier for others to ignore. The Tudor wife lived under this form of spiritual reasoning daily, rather than receiving support when she suffered. She received reminders to bear her suffering quietly. Those reminders often came from people who benefited from her restraint. This dynamic allowed the husband's faults to be overlooked or excused. If he acted unjustly, religious frameworks reframed the issue as a test of the wife's character rather than a failure of his. Her response became the focus, not his actions. This imbalance placed the emotional burden of the marriage squarely on her shoulders, supported by the weight of scripture, tradition, and communal expectation. Despite these pressures, she continued her duties with quiet steadiness. She prayed for guidance, carried her responsibilities faithfully, and maintained composure even when her inner life grew heavy. Religion gave her language for hope, but it also gave others justification for expecting her to endure more than any person should reasonably bear. Her ability to withstand hardship was praised as moral strength, while her pain remained largely invisible. In this world, faith was not merely a belief system, it was a tool that shaped behavior and reinforced hierarchy. It taught her that dignity lay in suffering well, that silence proved devotion, and that her value rested in how gracefully she endured the trials placed before her. These ideals molded her identity in ways she could not fully escape, becoming part of the foundation upon which her marriage rested. The teachings that shaped her faith also shaped her silence, urging her to accept pain as virtue and endurance as devotion. Another burden formed as these expectations blended with the challenges of her daily life. Within that growing weight, a deeper strain began to settle quietly across the household. Tension between the wife and the other woman in a Tudor household rarely appeared in open conflict, yet it shaped the atmosphere of the home with a quiet intensity. Each interaction carried a weight that neither dared to acknowledge aloud. Their lives intersected in the same corridors, dining rooms, and chambers, but those shared spaces held an uneasy balance that could shift with the slightest change in tone or gesture. Both women understood that displaying hostility would damage their reputations, so their conflict remained unspoken, lodged beneath the surface of daily routines. The wife often sensed the presence of the other woman long before any words were exchanged. A lowered gaze, a respectful curtsy, or a polite greeting revealed little on the surface. But she learned to read subtle markers: who lingered near her husband, who received small privileges, who servants whispered about after dark. These signs formed an undercurrent of awareness that shaped her actions. She monitored the household carefully, not to confront, but to understand her changing position within it. For the other woman, whether a mistress, a favoured maid, or a widowed relative temporarily residing in the home, interactions with the wife required equal caution. She could not appear too bold, nor too meek. Displaying confidence risked being interpreted as disrespect, while acting humble risked appearing weak or guilty. She learned to balance her presence carefully, ensuring she neither threatened the wife openly nor faded so far into the background that her importance diminished. Her place in the household was unstable, and any misstep could shift the delicate arrangement. The unspoken tension created a form of communication that relied more on observation than speech. A wife's polite smile could hide suspicion. A mistress's quiet obedience could conceal growing influence. A shared silence during meals could say more than any spoken remark. This environment demanded emotional precision from both women, who were constantly aware that any slip in decorum might become fuel for gossip among servants or relatives. Despite the strain, open confrontation was rare. The wife understood that public anger would reflect poorly on her, regardless of the circumstances. Her role required restraint, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to maintaining the household's outward harmony. Even when she felt undermined, she responded with calmness that concealed much deeper emotions. Her self-control became a protective layer, guarding both her position and her pride. The other woman avoided confrontation for different reasons. She had little legal protection, a little social authority, and limited influence beyond the attention she received. Challenging the wife openly would draw the scrutiny of the entire household and jeopardize her already precarious stability. Her safety depended on subtlety, on appearing cooperative, even when she held private ambitions or attachments that complicated the dynamic. There were times, however, when both women were forced into a kind of mutual coexistence. They attended the same meals, participated in the same household events, and sometimes even cooperated in managing domestic affairs. In these moments, they learned to adopt a quiet diplomacy. They exchanged controlled politeness, careful gestures, and measured tones that conveyed respect without warmth. The performance was essential because the household watched them closely, waiting for signs of imbalance. This form of coexistence resembled a workplace where two individuals with competing roles must maintain professionalism despite underlying rivalry. They were judged by how well they contained their emotions, how smoothly they fulfilled their responsibilities, and how convincingly they presented unity. The Tudor wife lived in this dynamic daily, aware that the smallest misinterpretation could shift opinion in favor of the other woman. At times, a strange calm formed between them, an understanding that both were trapped within the same system. Each woman carried her own fears, her own hopes, her own compromises. The wife feared losing influence or respect. The other woman feared losing security or affection. Both learned to navigate their shared environment with quiet calculation, aware that neither could fully escape the expectations placed upon them. The relationship remained defined not by what was spoken, but by what was withheld. Every silence, every glance, every controlled gesture revealed a world of emotion that etiquette forced them to keep hidden. Their connection became a complex mixture of rivalry, endurance, and reluctant coexistence, shaped by rules that neither had chosen. Yet both were bound to obey. Their quiet rivalry settled into the rhythm of the household, shaping every interaction without breaking into open conflict. Another shift approached in the obligations a wife faced when the consequences of her husband's choices entered her daily life. Within that approaching weight, a different kind of duty waited for her in silence. The presence of a child born from her husband's other relationship altered the balance of the household more profoundly than whispered rivalry ever could. A wife who had learned to endure silence, to manage tension with composure, now faced a responsibility she could neither protest nor refuse. The child arrived not as a visitor, but as a permanent part of the home, woven into its daily rhythms, with a legitimacy that forced her to reshape her role once again. In a Tudor household, lineage mattered more than the circumstances of conception, and the wife understood that her personal feelings held no authority against the demands of duty. The child's arrival was rarely dramatic. A servant brought the infant through the main hall, or a quiet knock signaled the moment she must step forward. No one asked if she wished to take on the task. No one questioned how she might feel. The house simply accepted the child, and she was expected to do the same. The courtesy she extended determined how others read her strength, her dignity, and her suitability as the central figure of the household. Any sign of reluctance could damage the fragile respect she struggled to maintain. The child was innocent, yet her presence became a mirror, reflecting the imbalance of her marriage. Every time she held the infant, an unspoken reminder settled quietly between her breaths. Someone else had occupied space she could not protect. The wife learned to steady her hands, to soften her expression, to keep her voice even. The household watched her closely during these moments. Servants whispered, relatives observed, and even the husband took subtle measures of her reaction. Her composure became a test she had not chosen, yet one she was expected to pass without faltering. Caring for the child required emotional discipline. She dressed the infant, soothed its cries, and ensured its well-being with a practiced tenderness that sometimes felt borrowed rather than freely given. The bond formed slowly, not through desire, but through repetition, through the unavoidable intimacy of daily care. She found herself memorizing the child's habits, the way tiny fingers curled around fabric, the quiet breaths taken after feeding. These small details slipped into her awareness, creating a connection she never intended to feel. Yet each moment of tenderness carried a complicated weight. The wife knew the child linked her husband to another woman in a way she could not erase. She understood how easily affection could deepen her own pain. And still, she continued with steady patience. Because refusal would fracture the household and reflect poorly on her character, her acceptance was seen as moral strength, a testament to her dignity, even though no one acknowledged the emotional cost required to maintain it. In a modern sense, her situation resembled someone required to guide a child who symbolizes a deep betrayal, all while being judged on how gracefully they managed the task. What should have been an intimate responsibility became a public demonstration of endurance. Every act of care unfolded under silent scrutiny. Her behavior was compared not to an ideal of fairness, but to an ideal of sacrifice that others valued more than her well-being. Even when the child grew older, the complexity remained. The wife might be responsible for the child's education, attire, or social training. She might watch the child interact with her husband in ways that blended affection and discomfort. She might oversee the child's place within the household hierarchy, ensuring they received proper treatment despite her own painful associations. Nothing about this duty was simple, yet the expectation remained constant. She must perform it with unwavering grace. Within the home, the child occupied a peculiar position, not fully an outsider, not fully embraced, yet undeniably present. The wife found herself navigating subtle boundaries, how much affection to show, how much distance to keep, and how to manage servants' behavior toward the child. Every decision shaped how the household understood her role. Too much warmth risked erasing her own boundaries. Too little invited judgment of cruelty. She walked a narrow line that shifted with each passing day. The emotional burden of this responsibility often settled into a quiet corner of her mind, where she stored all the other feelings she was not allowed to express. She built routines around the child, creating a sense of order that masked the internal conflict. Over time, the household forgot the strain behind her measured movements, interpreting her care as natural rather than necessary. Her suffering remained invisible, hidden behind a tenderness she had learned to perform. Despite everything, some wives formed genuine affection for the children entrusted to them, not because they had forgotten betrayal, but because caring became its own form of survival. The child needed stability, and providing it allowed the wife to shape at least one part of the household in a way that reflected her own values. Through care, she regained a small measure of control in a life where control was often denied. Her endurance taught the household something subtle. The wife's strength was not loud, not forceful, but steady. It revealed itself in how she protected a child who reminded her of pain, in how she preserved dignity when dignity felt impossible, and in how she continued to carry responsibilities no one acknowledged fully. The child she cared for settled into the household's daily rhythm, binding her to a duty she never asked for, yet still carried with unwavering steadiness. Another shift emerged as she searched for ways to secure her footing in a home that constantly tested her resolve. As that need for stability deepened, a quieter form of influence slowly began to take shape. Managing the household became one of the few areas where a Tudor wife could exercise authority without inviting scrutiny. While she had little legal power and limited influence over her husband's personal choices, she held responsibility for the rhythms, finance, and personnel that shaped daily life inside the home. This role, though often overlooked, allowed her to build a quiet structure of control, one that supported her position even when other parts of her marriage felt unsteady. Her authority emerged not from confrontation but from organization, expectation, and the steady consistency that only she could maintain. Household finances formed the core of this quiet power. The wife tracked expenses, allocated resources, and ensured that every member of the household, from servants to dependents, received what they required. She knew how much food was stored for the winter, how much cloth was needed for clothing, how much fuel the kitchen consumed, and how much was spent on each festival or guest visit. This intimate understanding of the household's economic life gave her leverage no one else possessed. If tensions arose, she could tighten supplies discreetly or redirect resources without appearing defiant. Decisions made under the guise of practicality often carried deeper intention, shaping the house's rhythm in ways others rarely noticed. Her role extended beyond finances into the management of personnel. Servants, though numerous, responded to her direction more than to her husband's authority. She assigned duties, addressed complaints, resolved conflicts, and determined who held responsibility for essential tasks. The wife understood that loyalty among servants strengthened her own stability. A well-managed household demonstrated her competence, and competence translated into respect, sometimes even fear. When new women entered the household, such as favored maids or extended relatives, the wife positioned them carefully within the staff hierarchy. She could limit their access to certain spaces, regulate their responsibilities, or subtly restrict their influence. All of this occurred behind polite smiles, framed as an administrative necessity rather than a personal strategy. Order became her most reliable defense. By maintaining a predictable structure, regular meals, consistent routines, and efficient servants, she created an environment where deviation was immediately noticeable. Order reflected her control, and control protected her from appearing weak in a household where weakness invited intrusion. Even when emotional strain pressed heavily on her, she moved through the home with steady purpose, directing and organizing with a quiet authority that no one openly challenged. People depended on her ability to maintain this environment, and dependence itself granted power. Her role in domestic management also created subtle relationships with those around her. Servants sought her approval. Children relied on her judgment. Visiting relatives observed her competence. Each interaction reinforced her presence as the central figure of the home. Even her husband, despite his authority, often deferred to her understanding of practical matters. He might control property, alliances, and public affairs, but she controlled the daily life that sustained all of it. This balance existed silently, yet it shaped the entire household structure. In modern terms, her influence resembled someone who manages the internal operations of a large organization while receiving little public acknowledgement. She oversaw the unseen mechanisms that allowed the house to function smoothly. And through that responsibility, she built a foundation of power that could not be easily removed. Her authority did not rely on affection or approval. It relied on necessity. The household needed her competence, and the more essential she became, the safer her position felt. Still, the emotional weight of this role could be heavy. The wife worked constantly, adjusting to changes, repairing disruptions, and smoothing over tensions between those living under the same roof. Her efforts kept the household from collapsing under conflict, yet they rarely earned recognition. She carried this responsibility in silence, understanding that visible strain would weaken her authority. Even so, she continued, because maintaining order offered her a sense of stability in a life where many aspects were beyond her control. Her domestic authority also shielded her from being overshadowed by other women. A mistress might hold her husband's attention, and a favored maid might enjoy small privileges, but neither controlled the structure of the home. The wife ensured that influence remained closely tied to responsibility, and responsibility belonged to her alone. She guarded this realm without open hostility, using routine and discipline as tools sharper than any argument. As she moved through the corridors, observing the work of servants or adjusting the household accounts, she claimed a space where her presence was unquestioned. In this domain, she was not overshadowed or replaced. She was essential, and though she rarely spoke of her efforts, the house reflected her touch in every organized corner, the quiet halls, the steady meals, the predictable order that kept daily life from unraveling. Her power was not loud, but it was lasting. Her command of the household shaped her identity as much as it shaped the structure around her, giving her a steadiness that others often overlooked. Another layer of comparison formed as other women watched her movements, measuring themselves against her quiet authority. From that silent observation, a deeper tension began to grow. Comparison inside a Tudor household unfolded quietly, yet it shaped the atmosphere with a pressure that rarely eased. The women who lived under the same roof, wife, mistress, favoured maid, widowed relative, shared spaces that made each detail of their lives visible. Every garment worn, every gesture observed, every moment of attention from the husband became part of an unspoken measurement. No one discussed these comparisons openly, but they existed in the pause between steps on the stairway, in the controlled tones at dinner, and in the glances exchanged across a crowded hall. Clothing played a central role in this silent hierarchy. A richer fabric, a deeper shade of dye, or a more elaborate trim signaled favour or access to resources. The wife, who was expected to uphold dignity, wore attire that reflected her formal status, yet she constantly noted the garments of other women. A mistress dressed in brighter colours risked being seen as too bold, yet a carefully chosen gown might reveal her rising influence. A maid who received finer materials than usual might signal shifting attention. Each thread carried meaning, and the wife learned to read these signals with practiced precision. Time offered another layer of comparison. How long the husband lingered in conversation with another woman, how often she crossed his path, or how frequently she appeared in shared spaces. All of these details shaped the wife's understanding of her position. She measured changes subtly, watching for patterns that might hint at altered affections or newly forming alliances. These observations were not born from pettiness, but from survival. In a house where authority shifted silently, awareness became a necessary form of protection. Servants added to this environment with their whispers and glances. They witnessed everything: who entered which room, who received a small kindness, who seemed unusually quiet. Their murmurs travelled through the household, shaping perception even when no one intended harm. A sideways look or a poorly concealed smirk could carry implications that lasted far longer than the moment itself. The wife understood how quickly impressions formed, and she navigated her days with careful restraint to avoid becoming the subject of unnecessary speculation. Psychological pressure built slowly under these conditions. The wife lived with the knowledge that every detail of her behavior was observed, compared, and interpreted. She measured her actions not only against other women, but against the expectations of the household as a whole. Her posture at meals, the steadiness of her voice, and the calm of her expression all contributed to how she was judged. The need to perform stability became part of her identity, shaping how she carried herself even during private moments of uncertainty. For the other women, comparison created similar burdens. The mistress monitored her own behavior to avoid appearing too assertive or too passive. A widowed relative balanced gratitude with caution, knowing her temporary presence could be misread. A favoured maid walked a narrow line between usefulness and suspicion. Each woman existed under the weight of being measured against the wife, against each other, and against the shifting expectations of the home. In a modern sense, this environment resembles a workplace where subtle competition and constant observation create emotional fatigue. Small advantages become sources of tension, and silence becomes a form of communication. The Tudor household magnified this experience because it merged personal relationships with social roles, leaving the women little room to separate emotion from duty. Their comparisons did not end at the threshold of the home. They seeped into daily routines, shaping how each woman understood herself. Despite this pressure, the women maintained outward calm. They greeted each other with polite tones, exchanged measured courtesies, and interacted as though nothing rested beneath the surface. This politeness was essential, not because they trusted one another, but because breaking decorum risked exposing vulnerabilities. Maintaining harmony, even false harmony, protected them from deeper conflict and preserved the fragile order the household depended upon. Yet the internal strain accumulated quietly. The wife felt it in the tightening of her breath when the mistress entered the room, in the slight tension of her shoulders when servants whispered, in the long moments before sleep when she replayed the day's interactions. Other women felt it as well, though none would admit it aloud. Their lives intertwined through shared proximity, yet their emotional landscapes remained isolated, shaped by comparison and quiet endurance. These silent tensions carved a subtle but lasting divide between the women. They existed together, but not entirely with one another, sharing space but guarded in spirit. Their identities shifted as they adjusted to the pressures of being observed, evaluated, and constantly measured. The comparisons never truly ended. They simply blended into the background, becoming part of the rhythm of the home. The unspoken measurements between them shaped every corner of the household, deepening the strain they carried without acknowledgement. Another truth surfaced as endurance became more than expectation. It became a strategy for survival. From that realization, a different understanding of strength began to rise quietly. Endurance inside a Tudor household was not merely a reflection of patience. It became a calculated method of survival. A wife who lived under the weight of comparison, silent rivalry, and shifting hierarchies understood that open resistance carried consequences she might never escape. To remain in her position, protected by legal status, social expectation, and the fragile respect of the household, she often chose restraint over confrontation. This choice did not reveal weakness, but a recognition of how precarious her stability truly was. Survival depended on silence, and silence required strength. The dangers of open defiance were real. A wife who challenged her husband publicly risked being labeled disobedient, a judgment that could erode her authority and embolden other women connected to him. Her anger, no matter how justified, became evidence used against her. Relatives might question her temperament, servants might whisper about her instability, and the household might slowly shift its perception of her. A single emotional outburst could undo years of careful composure. She learned that resisting openly often harmed her more than it harmed the person who caused the pain. Even a private protest carries risk. If she confronted her husband directly, he could dismiss her concerns, belittle her feelings, or retreat into the privileges granted to him by custom and law. He might grant more attention to the other woman, reduce her influence over household matters, or undermine her dignity through subtle actions. The wife understood that any misstep in these intimate negotiations could shift the balance of the home in ways she could not reverse. Her silence, though heavy, offered stability that protest could not guarantee. Holding her place required careful self-control. She managed her emotions as though they were part of the domestic responsibilities she carried. Tidied away, smoothed over, kept orderly. She watched her tone during meals, maintained a calm expression during gatherings, and restrained her reactions when faced with situations that cut deeply. Endurance became a discipline practiced daily. It kept her anchored in a home where losing composure meant losing ground. Silence functioned as a kind of armor. When she remained calm, the household saw dignity rather than vulnerability. Servants who monitored every shift in mood found no weakness to exploit. Other women, watching closely, could not point to any moment where she stumbled. Her restraint created a boundary that others respected, even if they did not fully understand it. The wife maintained her identity by controlling what she revealed. In a world that demanded so much from her, choosing silence gave her at least one area of control. This strategy echoed modern experiences, where individuals endure injustice because the alternatives threaten their security. It is the quiet negotiation of power within environments, where confrontation creates more harm than progress. The Tudor wife lived this reality each day, weighing the cost of action against the cost of endurance, often choosing the option that preserved her fragile stability. Yet endurance brought its own emotional burden. Conflicts did not disappear simply because they were unspoken. The strain accumulated behind her calm exterior, shaping the deeper layers of her internal life. She carried resentment she could not voice, fear she could not name, and disappointment she could not acknowledge. These emotions became part of her private landscape, visited only in quiet moments when she was finally alone. The weight of endurance shaped her identity as much as her duties did. Still, she persisted because staying mattered. Remaining the official wife ensured her children's legitimacy, protected her connection to property, and preserved her role in the lineage that defined the family. She understood that losing her place meant losing the protections that came with it, leaving her vulnerable in a world with limited options for women. Endurance allowed her to protect what mattered most, even when justice felt far out of reach. Her strength appeared in the smallest gestures, a steady breath when whispers reached her ears, a composed smile when tensions sharpened, a calm nod when others sought to provoke a reaction. She survived by navigating the household with quiet precision, understanding that stability, not fairness, was the resource she needed most. The world around her rewarded hidden resilience, not open struggle. Over time, endurance became a form of power. By refusing to break under pressure, she preserved the authority she held inside the home. Others recognized her steadiness and depended on it. Servants found reassurance in her reliability. Relatives respected her discipline. Even the husband, despite his faults, relied on her capacity to maintain order. Her silence did not erase her presence. It strengthened it. Her choice to endure shaped the structure of the home, allowing her to remain steady in a world that offered her little fairness. Another difficulty rose as emotional strain began to gather beneath her controlled surface. As that pressure continued to build, the hidden cost of her endurance started to reveal its quiet edge. Emotional isolation settled into a Tudor wife's life with a quiet persistence, shaping her inner world long before anyone around her noticed the change. She had learned to endure silently, to protect her position through restraint. Yet this discipline carried a high cost. The more she concealed her emotions to preserve harmony, the more distance grew between her and the people within her own home. She existed among servants, relatives, and other women. But the expectations placed on her created an invisible separation that no one acknowledged. Her thoughts became private out of necessity, and the deeper her silence, the more alone she felt. This isolation emerged most clearly in moments when she longed to express what she experienced, but found no safe place to do so. Speaking openly risked judgment. Confiding in servants invited gossip. Turning to relatives might expose her vulnerabilities. Even her husband, who should have been her closest companion, often stood at the center of the tensions she carried. She learned to keep her feelings contained, shaping her days around calm gestures and controlled tone, until the boundaries between restraint and isolation began to blur. Anxiety followed this isolation, building slowly across months and years. She monitored every glance exchanged in the household, every shift in routine, every change in her husband's behavior. Maintaining composure required constant vigilance. A single misstep, a tremble in her voice, a clouded expression, a moment of hesitation, could be interpreted as weakness. The fear of appearing unstable forced her to watch herself as carefully as she watched others. This vigilance drained her, leaving her with a steady undercurrent of unease that shaped her daily life. The uncertainty of her position intensified this feeling. She never knew when her influence might shift, when another woman might gain favor, or when a small rumor might threaten her dignity. Each day carried questions she could not speak aloud. Would the household remain orderly? Would her husband's attention drift further? Would she lose authority among the servants? The lack of clarity deepened her anxiety, weaving it into the rhythm of her thoughts until it felt like part of her identity. As anxiety grew, she began to lose her sense of self. The boundaries between her true feelings and the persona she maintained blurred until she struggled to recognize what she genuinely desired. Her life revolved around meeting expectations, managing the household with precision, responding politely to every situation, and preserving dignity in the face of emotional strain. The demands of this role consumed so much of her attention that little space remained for her own hopes or personal identity. She existed primarily through duty. There were moments, quiet ones, when she caught a glimpse of the woman she might have been. These moments arrived while she moved through empty corridors, or when she paused beside a window before anyone else awoke, or in the rare silence after the household settled for the night. She felt the distance between who she was expected to be and who she truly was. Yet acknowledging this difference offered no comfort, because she had no way to change the expectations that defined her life. Over time, the inner version of herself faded beneath the roles she performed. In modern terms, her experience resembled someone living in an environment where every reaction must be moderated, every emotion softened, every instinct restrained. This creates a constant tension between public presentation and private reality. The Tudor wife lived this tension daily, until her internal world became fragmented by the pressure to remain composed. She could not fully express sadness, anger, fear, or even joy. Each feeling had to be measured, filtered, and sometimes buried entirely. The household around her benefited from this quiet discipline. Servants saw stability, relatives saw dignity, her husband saw reliability. No one saw the emotional erosion hidden beneath her calm exterior. The more she appeared steady, the less anyone questioned what her steadiness cost her. She became valued for the very silence that intensified her suffering. Still, she continued, because breaking the structure around her felt impossible. The expectations placed on her were older than her marriage, older than her family, older than the home she lived in. She inherited a pattern of endurance passed down through generations of women who had learned the same lessons: survive by staying quiet, remain steady even when unsteady inside, protect the household at the expense of yourself. The emotional consequences did not burst suddenly into view. They settled gradually like dust, collecting in the corners of her life where no one looked. Her isolation deepened, her anxiety sharpened, her sense of self thinned. And yet, the household relied on her more than ever. She held everything together, even as she felt herself becoming less defined. The quiet weight she carried shaped her inner world, leaving marks no one around her ever truly recognized. Another shift arose when she began choosing survival through calculated negotiation rather than silent endurance alone. In that emerging approach, the nature of her compromises hinted at a hidden strength waiting to be uncovered. A Tudor wife, who had endured in silence long enough, eventually learned that survival sometimes required shaping the circumstances around her rather than simply absorbing them. She understood the constraints of her position, the limits placed on her voice, and the expectations that pressed against her each day. Instead of resisting those constraints openly, she began to negotiate her place within them. These negotiations did not take the form of spoken agreements or formal arrangements. They unfolded through daily choices, measured reactions, and quiet adjustments that allowed her to preserve stability in a life she could not fully control. One of the most common forms of compromise involved the division of space. Tudor homes were large yet crowded, full of servants, relatives, and lingering obligations. Privacy was scarce. A wife who sought emotional safety learned to claim certain rooms, or routines, or hours of the day as her own. She accepted that her husband might occupy different parts of the home, sometimes with the presence of another woman, and instead of confronting this directly, she created boundaries that kept her dignity intact. The spaces she curated, her chamber, the solar, the gardens, became quiet territories where her authority remained unquestioned. Maintaining these areas allowed her to regain a sense of control, even when she could not dictate what took place elsewhere. Another form of compromise came through choosing not to intervene in her husband's other relationships. This decision did not reflect acceptance of betrayal. Instead, it represented a pragmatic understanding of the dynamics she lived within. Confrontation offered no guarantee of change and often resulted in consequences that left her more vulnerable. By refusing to pursue conflict, she protected her position in the household and avoided drawing further attention to situations she could not alter. Her restraint was a strategy, one that allowed her to maintain her formal status without appearing unstable or possessive, qualities that Tudor society judged harshly in women. This non-interference often required a level of emotional discipline that outsiders could not appreciate. She heard whispers, I saw glances, and recognized patterns that confirmed what she quietly endured. Yet she responded with a composed stillness that others mistook for indifference. In reality, her silence was an active choice. It kept the household from fracturing further, prevented fuel for gossip, and allowed her to remain the figure of order in a world prone to chaos. By not reacting, she held on to the authority that came from being the one person who did not lose control. Her compromises also created a form of stability that benefited the entire household. Servants worked more efficiently when tensions remained contained. Children sensed calm rather than conflict. Relatives found a home free of scandal. Even the husband relied on her steadiness, often without acknowledging it. The wife understood that stability protected her as much as it protected others. In the absence of formal power, she made herself indispensable through her ability to maintain the household structure. This influence was subtle but real, built not through defiance, but through careful, deliberate moderation. In modern terms, her strategy resembles navigating a workplace or family environment where confrontation threatens one's position, and choosing restraint becomes a calculated form of self-preservation. It is not submission but survival, a controlled response to an unbalanced system. The Tudor wife used this approach because the alternative often left her with fewer protections and fewer options. Stability mattered more than fairness, not because fairness was unimportant, but because losing stability meant losing everything she relied on. Her compromises shaped her identity in ways both strengthening and diminishing. On one hand, she proved capable of negotiation, adaptability, and emotional discipline that few could match. On the other hand, she sacrificed parts of herself to maintain this balance, burying frustrations that had no safe outlet. Each compromise carried a cost, yet she continued, because the structure she preserved kept her children secure, her household orderly, and her dignity intact. There were moments when these negotiations softened the tension between her and others in the home. With boundaries established, she sometimes found unexpected peace in the routine she created. Maintaining order offered a sense of purpose. The household responded to her steadiness, acknowledging her central role, even if they never spoke of it directly. Stability, though imperfect, became its own form of relief. Over time, her strategy shaped not just her survival, but her authority. She did not command through force or demand, but through presence, steady, calm, and unwavering. Those around her came to rely on that presence. Even those who challenged her position could not dismiss the influence she maintained through her quiet compromises. Each decision she made, each boundary she set, each moment she withheld reaction, strengthened her unspoken power within the household. Her careful negotiations helped her endure the shifting tensions of the home, allowing stability to take root where conflict might have taken hold. Another truth surfaced as her quiet strength shaped daily life more deeply than others realized. Through that rising influence, the meaning of power within a Tudor household began to reveal an unexpected depth. Not every Tudor wife lived entirely at the mercy of her circumstances, while many endured silently. Some possessed forms of influence that shifted the balance of power inside the home more than outsiders ever realized. Their authority did not emerge from confrontation or open defiance, but from deeper foundations. Family lineage, legitimate children, and the quiet certainty that their position could not be easily displaced. These wives navigated the household with a steadiness that reflected not resignation but strategy, shaping the environment around them with subtle but unmistakable force. Family lineage was often the strongest anchor a wife could possess. A woman born into a powerful or respected house carried her heritage into her marriage like a shield. Her relatives held land, wealth, or political influence that her husband depended on, even if he rarely acknowledged it aloud. Servants treated her with heightened respect, knowing her family connections offered stability or protection. Relatives visiting the estate showed deference to her presence. Even her husband approached certain decisions cautiously, aware that mistreating her might provoke consequences beyond the household walls. This embedded authority acted as a barrier against mistresses or competing women who lacked the same foundation. Control through legitimate children formed another quiet, enduring source of strength. A wife whose sons or daughters held legal rights to inheritance occupied a position no mistress could rival. The future of the lineage flowed through her children. She oversaw their tutors, their clothing, their manners, and their daily routines, ensuring they grew into symbols of continuity that secured her place. Even a husband's wandering attentions could not erase the significance of her children. Their legitimacy tied the household to her in ways that could not be undone, giving her influence through the future rather than the present. Her authority over children extended into daily interactions. Servants responded to the needs of future heirs before all others. Relatives treated her with respect because her children represented the continuation of their shared bloodline. The other women in the house recognized this subtle hierarchy. No matter how favored they might be in private, they could not alter the formal structure that placed the wife and her children at the center. The wife did not need to raise her voice. The lineage itself spoke for her. This form of power often manifested in ways that were easy to overlook. The wife determined the children's schedules, their clothing, and their exposure to certain influences. She shaped their loyalties through consistency and tenderness. As the children grew, they learned to rely on her for emotional steadiness, something the shifting nature of their father's affections could not provide. The household revolved around these rhythms she cultivated, giving her a sense of purpose that extended far beyond the domestic tasks assigned to her. Endurance, in these cases, did not signify weakness. It reflected the wife's understanding of the system she lived within and her ability to navigate it with precision. She recognized where direct resistance would fail and where quiet strength would achieve what force could not. Her silence was not passive. It was controlled, deliberate, and purposeful. She chose her battles with care, knowing that stability offered her more than confrontation ever could. In a modern sense, this dynamic mirrors environments where individuals wield influence through relationships, long-standing credibility, or structural roles rather than direct authority. Their power is quiet but deeply rooted. The Tudor wife operated in a similar space. She did not need to dominate to remain central. Her presence was already bound to the household through lineage, responsibility, and the social weight of her official position. Some wives used this position to guide the household more than anyone realized. They coordinated alliances through correspondence, influenced the decisions of relatives, or shaped the development of younger family members. Even if they could not control their husband's private actions, they could direct the practical and social life of the estate. Their decisions rippled outward, affecting events in ways subtle enough to avoid suspicion, but significant enough to alter outcomes. In certain homes, the wife's authority became so integral that removing her, even emotionally, would have caused the entire structure to destabilize. Mistresses came and went, favors rose and fell, but the wife remained the central figure, the anchor around which everything else rotated. Her presence did not depend on affection. It depended on her irreplaceable function within the system. Even those who appeared quiet possessed an inner resilience that shaped how others treated them. Their gestures carried weight. Their silence held meaning. And their endurance communicated strength more persuasively than confrontation ever could. In the layered environment of a Tudor home, where alliances shifted and hierarchies were fragile, this quiet strength mattered more than visible authority. Her influence did not need to be loud to be real, nor did her endurance erase the strength she carried through lineage and legitimacy. Another tension formed as questions surrounding inheritance began to rise, drawing attention toward the children who defined the household's future. As that focus sharpened, the fragile balance of family bloodlines revealed a deeper uncertainty waiting beneath the surface. Questions of bloodline shaped every corner of a Tudor household, creating tensions that reached far deeper than personal relationships. A wife who had already endured rivalries, assailante, comparaison, and shifting alliances understood that her true stability depended on the status of her children. Their legitimacy became both her shield and her responsibility, tying her identity to the future of the family in ways she could not escape. In a world where lineage defined inheritance, power, and social standing, the difference between a legitimate child and one born outside formal marriage carried consequences that lasted for generations. A legitimate child, especially a son, held a place that no mistress, no favored companion, and no competing influence could undermine. The wife, fully aware of this, devoted much of her emotional energy to safeguarding her children's position. She monitored their education, ensured they received proper instruction, and protected their image within the household. Servants treated the legitimate children with a formality distinct from others, recognizing the future roles they might hold. Even the husband acknowledged this difference, for his lineage depended on the children born within lawful marriage. Their presence affirmed her authority in ways no personal affection could. Still, the existence of illegitimate children complicated the balance. These children, born of relationships the wife could not control, nonetheless lived under the same roof or maintained connections to the household. Some were acknowledged by the husband, others were quietly supported, and some arrived unexpectedly, presented as obligations the household must absorb. Their presence reminded the wife of the fragile nature of her marriage, revealing emotional wounds she often had no choice but to conceal. The illegitimate children did not intend harm, but the circumstances of their birth created a quiet turbulence she was expected to manage with composure. Despite the tension, the wife rarely blamed the children themselves. She directed her restraint toward preserving order rather than expressing resentment. A child born outside the marriage was often innocent of the conflicts surrounding their existence, yet their presence forced the wife to navigate a delicate emotional landscape. She balanced fairness with self-protection, kindness with caution. She ensured no one questioned the legitimacy of her own children, even as she treated the others with a measured calm that prevented scandal. Protecting her offspring required constant vigilance. The wife observed how servants interacted with her children, ensuring loyalty remained intact. She monitored how relatives spoke about them, guarding their reputations against careless remarks. She kept close watch on the husband's behavior, noting whether he favored an illegitimate child too openly. Such favoritism, even if unintentional, threatened to undermine her children's place in the household hierarchy. The wife responded not with confrontation but with subtle corrections, adjusting routines, influencing household decisions, or quietly reminding others of her children's formal status. In modern terms, her situation resembles a parent navigating a blended family under unequal rules, where every gesture carries potential implications for the future. But in Tudor society, the stakes were far higher. Inheritance, property, and the continuation of the family name depended on legitimacy. Even a whisper of doubt could erode her children's standing. The wife learned to anticipate threats before they emerged, ensuring no rumor or careless comparison jeopardized their future. Her children, watching her closely, absorbed the quiet discipline she practiced. They learned to carry themselves with dignity, to navigate household politics without speaking of them directly. Their mother's vigilance shaped their upbringing, teaching them the weight of reputation long before they understood its meaning. Through them, the wife extended her influence across generations, ensuring that her sacrifices strengthened the family's long-term stability. Illegitimate children, though present, remained on the margins of this structure. They depended on the household's generosity, but could never fully enter its core. The wife ensured boundaries remained intact, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. She could offer courtesy, guidance, or even care, but she guarded the distinction that upheld her children's rights. This balance required constant emotional discipline, a steady awareness of her role, and a quiet strength few acknowledged. The conflict between fairness and duty shaped her inner world. She sometimes felt compassion for the children who bore the consequences of their father's choices. Yet she never allowed compassion to weaken her resolve. Her children's future depended on the clarity of lineage, and she protected that clarity with a determination born from both love and survival. Through these responsibilities, the wife's identity became intertwined with the family's legacy. Her success as a mother reflected not only her personal devotion, but also her ability to navigate a household filled with competing loyalties. She defended her children's place with the same quiet strength she used to preserve her own, holding firm against the subtle forces that threatened their standing. The structure she defended shaped the household's future, anchoring her children firmly within the lineage that gave her purpose. Another shift approached as the presence of rival women waned, raising questions about what victory meant for a wife who had endured so much. After that turning point, the traces of conflict lingered longer than anyone expected. The removal of another woman from the household, whether a mistress dismissed quietly, a favoured maid sent away, or a relative relocated under the guise of family duty, did not bring the sense of triumph outsiders might imagine. For the Tudor wife, this change arrived not as a victory, but as a moment wrapped in caution. She had endured long enough to understand that any sign of celebration would expose her inner wounds, threaten her dignity, and risk igniting new whispers within the home. So she kept her expression steady, her posture composed, and her voice measured, as though nothing had shifted at all. Silence once again became her refuge. The household reacted in subtle ways. Servants noticed the absence immediately, though none spoke of it openly. Corridors felt different. Routines shifted slightly, and the tension that had lingered in shared spaces dissolved with a quiet, almost unsettling calm. Yet beneath that calm lay traces of conflict, unspoken, unresolved, and still deeply felt. The wife observed these changes with practiced restraint, aware that acknowledging them would expose more than she wished others to see. She had learned through painful experience that visible emotion could be used against her. Outwardly, order appeared restored. Meals unfolded without strained glances. The children moved through the rooms more freely, and the wife resumed her duties with unbroken steadiness. But this restoration existed only on the surface. The removal of a rival did not erase the months or years of comparison, quiet humiliation, and emotional effort she had carried. It simply removed the visible source, leaving behind the deeper scars that never received the opportunity to heal. Her endurance had kept her stable, yet it had also left marks she could not easily acknowledge. These internal wounds revealed themselves in private moments. She might pause longer than necessary before entering a room once associated with tension. She might flinch at a passing memory, or find her breath tightening when reminded of an old whisper. The absence of the other woman did not undo the emotional labor she had spent protecting her dignity. Instead, it highlighted the weight she had carried. Now that there was no rival to distract from its presence, calmness did not mean relief. It meant recovery had only begun. She also understood that removal did not guarantee permanence. A dismissed mistress might return under different circumstances. A favoured maid might regain attention. A household accustomed to shifting alliances could always shift again. The wife lived with this awareness, and it shaped how she processed the aftermath. She could not rely on change as security. She relied only on the stability she constructed through discipline and presence. The absence of another woman restored space, but not certainty. In a modern sense, her experience resembles someone who sees a workplace rival depart yet feels no celebration, only exhaustion. The conflict is over, but the toll remains. Her emotional landscape still holds the echoes of every moment she endured quietly. Victory feels hollow because it was achieved through survival, not through justice. Despite the wounds, the household looked to her for steadiness. Servants adjusted their routines according to her expectations. Children returned to her for guidance. Relatives interpreted her composed behavior as strength. The wife resumed her place, not because her situation simplified, but because others depended on her ability to maintain order. In this way, her endurance once again became the structure that held the household together. She moved through the rooms with the same collected grace she had used throughout the tension. Her gestures remained calm, her words careful, her presence steady. Outsiders might assume she felt relief, but those who watched more closely could sense the heaviness beneath her composure. The departure of another woman removed a visible threat, but left behind the emotional debris of years spent navigating uncertain ground. Still, she continued. She set the tone of the household, directed the servants with precision, and protected her children with renewed focus. The absence of rivalry allowed her to reclaim parts of herself that had been overshadowed by constant vigilance. Yet recovery came slowly, unfolding in moments rather than sweeping change. The scars remained, not as reminders of weakness, but as proof of everything she had endured. Her dignity, maintained through silence, had carried her through the worst moments. Now, in the quiet that followed, she found herself confronting the cost of that silence. The home felt calmer, but she felt older, marked by the strain. Strengthened by necessity, she had survived a situation designed to fracture her. And though victory brought little celebration, it affirmed a steadiness she alone truly understood. Her world regained its outward order, yet the emotional wounds remained, shaping her days long after the source of conflict had disappeared. Another weight emerged as she considered what these years of endurance meant for her future and for the future of the household. Beneath that reflection, the long-term cost of living this way began to press more heavily on her spirit. The emotional toll of a Tudor wife's life did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated quietly, settling into her thoughts with a weight that deepened year after year. She had endured rivalries, shifting alliances, and responsibilities she never asked for, all while maintaining the appearance of composure expected of her. Over time, this quiet endurance wore down the inner parts of herself she once recognized. Moments of joy felt muted. Moments of fear lingered longer than they should. And moments of peace became brief pauses rather than true reprieves. The steady erosion of her emotional strength shaped her life more profoundly than any single conflict ever had. This sense of exhaustion grew from the countless ways she monitored her behavior. She had learned to manage her tone, guard her expressions, and measure every reaction. Such vigilance required constant mental effort. Even in the privacy of her own chamber, she struggled to release the tension she carried. Her thoughts returned again and again to the uncertainties of her position, the expectations placed upon her, and the memory of insults delivered through silence rather than words. Emotional fatigue settled over her days like a thin veil that never lifted fully. As she moved through the home, she did what she had always done. She maintained order, preserved dignity, and upheld the appearance of harmony. But beneath those actions lived a kind of tiredness she could not name. Her identity had become so intertwined with endurance that she sometimes forgot who she had been before marriage, before rivalry, before the constant need to prove steadiness. She had given so much of herself to the demands of the household that only fragments remained untouched by expectation. This slow loss of self was not dramatic, but it shaped every part of her internal world. The emotional patterns she lived with extended beyond her alone. Her children observed her restraint, even if they did not understand its origin. They watched how she softened her voice to avoid conflict, how she held sadness inside rather than expressing it, how she navigated tensions with calm precision. These quiet lessons passed from her to them, forming unspoken expectations they, too, would carry into their own futures. The endurance she practiced became a model of behavior, shaping how the next generation understood conflict, emotion, and silence. This transmission was not intentional. She did not wish for her children to inherit the burdens she bore. Yet the nature of the household made it inevitable. The norms that shaped her decisions shaped theirs by proximity, traditions of restraint, expectations of obedience, and the belief that suffering must be carried quietly to preserve dignity. The emotional legacy she passed on was woven from necessity rather than desire. Yet it remained one of the strongest inheritances she left behind. Silence, once her shield, gradually became part of the household culture. Servants learned to speak in careful tones. Relatives avoided naming tensions directly, and her children absorbed the idea that speaking openly carried danger. Over time, silence hardened into a family pattern, something that felt natural even as it masked deeper wounds. The wife had used silence to protect herself, but as the years passed, silence became its own force, shaping the atmosphere long after the original conflicts faded. This legacy of quiet endurance created a sense of distance that stretched across generations. Children grew into adults who repeated the same emotional patterns. They learned to hide discomfort, suppress resentment, and present composure even when their inner lives grew heavy. Household conflicts unfolded through gestures and glances rather than words. Continuing the cycle of unspoken tension, the wife had not intended to create such an inheritance. Yet the structure of Tudor life left little room for alternatives. In a modern sense, her experience resembles families where emotional restraint becomes a tradition, where adults remember the household as orderly but heavy, peaceful but silent. The Tudor wife lived this reality every day, shaping the atmosphere around her, whether she meant to or not. Her endurance, though necessary, left ripples that extended far beyond her own lifetime. Despite these consequences, she continued her duties with the same steady presence she had cultivated for years. She understood that the emotional cost she carried would never be acknowledged fully. Yet she kept the household functioning with unwavering resolve. Her quiet strength remained the foundation of the home, even as it drained parts of herself she could not reclaim. Her life revealed a truth few would ever voice aloud. Stability often came at the expense of personal peace. She held the structure of the home together, but the structure took its toll. She preserved harmony, but harmony left scars. She endured for the sake of others, and her endurance became the legacy she passed forward. Not because she chose it, but because the world she lived in allowed no other path. The weight she carried shaped not only her spirit, but the generations that followed, embedding silence deep into the household's identity. Another question rose quietly as time passed. If no one living under that roof felt truly at ease, what did all this endurance actually protect? Through that lingering question, the unrest hidden inside the home began to reveal a faint and unsettling echo. A Tudor household often appeared orderly from the outside, its routines polished into something steady and predictable. Yet beneath that surface, each person living within its walls carried a different kind of unrest. The wife, who upheld the home with her endurance, felt the strain of constant vigilance. The other women who passed through the household, mistress, favoured companions, widowed relatives, lived in a state of uncertainty, never fully secure in their place. And the husband, though holding unquestioned authority, moved through the home with the weight of expectations shaped by tradition more than emotion. All three inhabited the same space, yet none found true peace within it. For the wife, the absence of peace came from the emotional discipline required to maintain her position. Each day asked to conceal distress, suppress anger, and present calm where she felt none. She carried the burden of managing the household's atmosphere, smoothing tensions others created, and enduring situations she had no power to change. This constant restraint formed a quiet, inward pressure that shaped her life more deeply than any single conflict. Even moments of calm felt fragile, hovering above memories she could not forget. The other woman, no matter her role, lived in a different kind of unease. She might receive attention from her husband, yet she carried no legal protections or lasting security. A shift in the husband's mood, a word from the wife's family, or a rumour whispered by servants could remove her from the home as suddenly as she had entered it. Her position depended on favour, not stability. She learned to read tones, gestures, and silences with a precision born from necessity. Every kindness could be temporary. Every privilege could vanish overnight. The uncertainty itself became a form of quiet suffering. Even the husband, who held the authority to shape the household as he pleased, did not escape the unrest. Tradition demanded he maintain control, provide heirs, protect his lineage, and manage alliances, all while navigating the unspoken tensions his actions created. The structure that granted him power also isolated him, placing expectations on his decisions that did not always align with his desires. His authority brought responsibility, scrutiny, and the constant awareness that any imbalance within the household ultimately reflected on him. Power did not guarantee peace. It merely changed the shape of the burdens he carried. The servants observed all of this silently, acting as witnesses to a home where no one spoke openly of discomfort, but everyone felt its presence. They saw the wife's quiet exhaustion, the other woman's tentative steps, and the husband's moments of controlled frustration. Their whispers, though cautious, travelled through the corridors, weaving the household's tensions into its daily rhythm. The home existed in a balance that relied on unspoken agreements and carefully maintained illusions. In modern terms, this environment resembles families or institutions where everyone plays a role in preserving stability that feels fragile beneath the surface. Each person contributes to the appearance of harmony, yet their private experiences reveal a different reality. The Tudor home magnified this tension because its structure depended on hierarchy, duty, and expectations that offered little room for genuine emotional expression. What made the lack of peace most striking was the proximity in which these individuals lived. They shared meals, walked the same halls, and inhabited rooms separated only by thin walls. Yet their inner worlds remained distant. They moved around one another with caution, each carrying burdens they could not voice. The house itself absorbed their silences, becoming a place shaped as much by what went unspoken as by what was done. Despite the unease, life continued in measured patterns. The wife managed the household's order, the other woman navigated her uncertain standing, and the husband upheld the authority expected of him. Their routines intertwined without ever resolving the deeper tensions beneath them. Stability was preserved, but at the cost of emotional truth. Peace existed only as performance. The longer these patterns persisted, the heavier the atmosphere became. The wife felt the strain in the tightening of her breath. The other woman felt it in the cautiousness of her steps. The husband felt it in the moments when control did not bring satisfaction. Each carried a different version of unrest, all shaped by the same structure that held them together. No one living in the household chose this tension entirely, yet each sustained it in ways they could barely admit. The house remained functional, even respectable, but the lives inside it bore the weight of unvoiced struggles that never fully disappeared. Their shared home held routines that looked orderly from the outside, yet everyone inside carried a quiet unrest that shaped their days. Another truth approached as time revealed what years of tension, silence, and fragile balance ultimately left behind. From that lingering imprint, the deeper legacy of Tudor marriage began to take on a darker and more unsettling form. The legacy of Tudor marriage did not end when the households themselves faded into history. What remained was a long-lasting expectation placed on women, carried quietly from one generation to the next. Sacrifice became a measure of worth, something assumed rather than chosen. For centuries, the image of a good wife continued to resemble the Tudor ideal, someone who held the family together, accepted limits on her own voice, and endured emotional weight without protest. That expectation survived, not because it was gentle, but because it became woven into the moral framework of the societies that followed. And once a pattern settles into memory, it becomes difficult to fully recognize how deeply it shapes the lives that come after. The endurance of women in Tudor households was often transformed into admiration. Writers, chroniclers, and even later historians sometimes softened the truth, describing patience as strength and suffering as virtue. In these retellings, the emotional cost disappears. The long nights spent alone, the effort required to stay composed in front of others, the quiet moments where fear or exhaustion overtakes the body, these are rarely acknowledged. Instead, the stories highlight loyalty, duty, and perseverance, as if these qualities existed without pain. But what happened inside those homes was not a gentle kind of devotion. It was survival shaped by the constraints of a world that offered women very few choices. Over time, this romanticized endurance became an inheritance on its own. Later households across Europe mirrored the structure of Tudor marriage. Even when the laws began to shift, women were still expected to maintain calm, to absorb emotional tension, to protect family dignity with their silence. The husband's authority was still framed as natural, even when it caused harm. And within the walls of many homes, the balance of power remained uneven long after the Tudor era ended. The echoes of those old expectations stayed alive not in law books, but in daily habits, in unspoken social rules, and in the quiet pressure to endure more than anyone should be asked to. What is often forgotten is that Tudor households functioned on the hidden labor of emotional restraint. A wife's composure was essential to preserving the appearance of order. If she faltered, the home faltered with her. She learned to manage not just servants and accounts, but the delicate equilibrium between herself, her husband, and any other woman whose presence unsettled the structure. This emotional management was a form of work, constant, exhausting, and rarely acknowledged. And because it was invisible, it became easier for later generations to misinterpret it as simple obedience rather than a complex and difficult survival strategy. The stories of these women also endure in quieter forms, in letters that hint at sorrow without naming it, in objects passed down through families, in records of marriages that lasted decades, but reveal very little about the personal lives inside them. A Tudor wife might be remembered in a family tree as the mother of several children, the keeper of a household, the partner in an alliance, but not as someone who navigated daily negotiations of power, insecurity, and emotional risk. Her legacy is not measured in titles, but in the strength required to keep living within a structure that rarely considered her needs. The romanticization of Tudor endurance also obscures the truth about marriages that looked stable but were shaped by unequal expectations. Many wives understood, long before modern words existed to describe it, that their emotional world could not be spoken aloud. The pressure to remain composed, to avoid conflict, to serve as the moral center of the home. These demands were heavy, and though they learned to live with them, that does not mean the weight was ever light. The legacy of these unspoken burdens traveled through time, carried quietly by women who grew up watching their mothers navigate the same patterns. Yet the legacy is not solely bleak. The resilience developed in such households allowed some women to build forms of influence that did not rely on public authority. They learned to read people carefully, to understand tension before it surfaced, to manage relationships with precision. These skills, while born from inequality, became tools for survival and subtle power. Some Tudor wives protected their children's futures with remarkable determination. Some controlled household finances with firm discipline. Others maintained networks of extended family and allies that strengthened their position far beyond their expected role. Their endurance, while costly, sometimes gave them a quiet form of control that shaped the lives of those around them. Still, the deeper legacy of Tudor marriage lies in its emotional impact. The pressure to endure did not leave when the era ended. It remained in the expectation that women should carry responsibility for maintaining peace, even when the situation was unfair. It lingered in the idea that silence in the face of discomfort is admirable. It reappeared in stories that celebrate patience without questioning the circumstances that required it. And even today, traces of that expectation can be seen in relationships where one person feels compelled to absorb tension, to compromise endlessly, or to hide their true feelings to avoid conflict. What truly happened under a Tudor roof was far from simple. It was a world where hierarchy shaped every relationship, where emotional truth was often hidden, and where survival sometimes meant accepting limits that no one should have had to bear. The marriages of that time were not peaceful sanctuaries, but carefully balanced systems held together by structure and silence. Understanding their legacy requires acknowledging both the strength of the individuals who lived through them and the weight of the expectations that shaped their lives. And so, the final truth of Tudor marriage is this: the houses looked stable, but the people inside them carried stories that were never easy. Their endurance became history, but their struggles remained largely unseen. What they lived through still whispers into the present, reminding us that silence can hold more weight than words. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with me. May your night be gentle, and may sleep come easily. Good night.